Hi, Sabina. It's great to connect today. Thanks so much for coming on the podcast.
Thank you so much for having me, Nate.
You've had an incredible career both at Microsoft and then as a C-suite coach. And as you think about the things you've learned about leadership, what lesson would you most like to pass on to others?
Hmm. The biggest lesson I'd like to pass on is that it is not power that corrupts when you're in these positions, but pressure. The higher you go, the more pressure you encounter in your roles, more pressure than any one human being can possibly withstand. And that's not to mention the pressures in the world, the pressures in our families, and everything else. And by corrupt, I mean it causes us to behave in ways that have an adverse effect on the people who work for us. When I interview people to find out what it is like to actually work for that boss, the number one complaint across thousands of interviews is this person has a hard impact on me. And this is problematic, not just because it's not the right thing to do, but because research shows that when employees feel dissed, they sabotage their work. They they think about that. They deliberately insert errors just to get back at their boss. One example of this was a university president who was under tremendous pressure because things had significantly shifted around the way they made money, the way the grants were funded. The board of trustees had a new chair who the president didn't get along with. The students were agitating on a couple of key issues. So there was a lot of pressure, and this person was under the gun. His behavior started to change. He became snippy. He lost his patience quite a lot. He would raise his voice. He would make sarcastic comments and kind of raise his eyebrow. He was a somewhat subtle person, so even a slight raise of the eyebrow, people knew he was very displeased. So, at a time where there was strife with students, with the board, suddenly his cabinet also started to have an adverse rub with him. But the worst part of it was that he didn't realize that's what was happening. Because the second component to pressure is power. And nobody tells you the exact truth when you're in a position of power, particularly when you're acting out, because you have so much control over the people and their destinies on your team. So it took a while, and then people started complaining around him to the board, and the board contacted me, and that's how this whole process started to get unpacked. And he was completely shocked because he thought of himself as a great human being. And I don't really think that there are, with very few exceptions, purely good or bad human beings or purely good or bad bosses. It's bad behaviors that get forged under pressure.
Yeah, it's so interesting because if you think back to, in like all of human history, like how often was one person in charge of 90,000 people, a million people? And these corporations have gotten so large, and our ability to coordinate activities has gotten to the point where we have these organizations that are just larger than any that have ever existed in the past. And so I was especially intrigued by this lesson. It's not the power that corrupts, it's the pressure. You have a personal experience with this as well, right? I mean, as you rose up the ranks at Microsoft.
Yeah, absolutely. I discovered, again, I was surprised as well when a colleague told me that people were crying as a result of having had conversations with me. I had become a lousy manager. And you know what? The funny thing is, I started off with feedback that I was one of the best managers people had because I cared deeply about my people, what they were working on, their career development. I poured in a lot of time. And then I got promoted, went to have my first baby. The first day on the way back from parental leave, my assistant called me frantic. Where are you? Steve's expecting you in 30 minutes. I have no idea why the CEO of Microsoft was wanting to meet with me. So I'm having my assistant read out the memo on my drive to work, and that set the pace for when I came back. Relentless, along with the relentless infant crying at night,
Yeah.
refusing to sleep. So all of that pressure bubbled up, and I started to micromanage. I started to be short and snippy myself. I told myself they're adults. Time for empathy will come later. Of course, there was no later. And it was a complete gut punch when my colleague pointed this out to me that people were crying in their offices. That's what started to get me curious about what happens where the same person can be worst boss ever and best boss ever.
Yeah.
So it's less personal and more positional. It's more about the pressures and the circumstances in which you find yourself. This doesn't mean you don't take accountability for that, but it's important to recognize it could happen to anyone.
Yeah, that's a great point. It's so easy to underappreciate how much the situation matters. So when I teach leadership, I talk about, um, how important not only the personality traits and characteristics and behaviors of the leader are, but how much the situation matters and how much the followers matter. And it's just so easy for people to think like, if I'm a great leader, then I have 100% control of what happens in the organization. And it's like, no, you really have like a fraction of a percentage of control because all of these other things matter so much. And I love this phrase of it's less personal and more positional. The position can really impact us in ways that we don't appreciate. So, how did you overcome this, and how do you help others fight this tendency to micromanage or let the pressure get to them?
Mm-hmm. There are a number of tools that I've refined along with my clients and road tested over the years when they get this kind of feedback. And it's about deploying some of those. One is to simply use what I call your shut up muscle, which is to not over participate, not over speak, and listen to what others are saying. Because often when you do that, you allow others to shine, you get their ideas, and you don't have to work as hard. So, a couple of ways to use the shut up muscle. One would be to simply be the third or later to speak, not the first to speak.
Mm,
How often do we jump in and speak? And once we speak, nobody's going to speak after that, or they're not certainly not going to disagree and have that creative conflict
mhm.
that's important for innovation and for ideas to flourish. So, what if you were the third or later to speak? And another could be taking what I call margin notes. So, in the margin of your notebook, write down those ideas that you're afraid you're going to lose so you don't interrupt other people. And you know what? The great news is, let's say you have 5 margin notes, maybe 3 of those somebody else already suggested. Great. It builds their
Yeah.
confidence. And now, when you add value, you're adding unique value add, something that others hadn't yet contributed.
Yeah, great tips. I feel like the older we get and the more experience we have, the more thoughts and ideas we can share that are relevant to whatever we're discussing. And so this tendency to speak more is
Yes.
probably just becomes it's like harder and harder.
Yes, and we tell ourselves, Nate, that we're trying to be helpful or we're trying to be make things go faster, but it's really just serving a short-term need, scratching a short-term itch that is best left unscratched so that others can flourish.
Yeah, and I love the margin notes. Like, okay, write them down, hold off. Hopefully, others come up with the ideas. That's a win-win for them. And then when it's our turn, then we can potentially add some new insight if we need to. But that way, we're not stealing other people's thunder. So, okay, I love this. The shut up muscle. I've never actually heard that phrase. I love it. Any other ways that you teach people to make sure they don't become a victim of the pressure?
Nate, I'm sure you speak about delegation with your students.
Hmm.
And the number one mistake people make with delegating is treating it like an on-off switch. Here, I'm delegating to you. I empower you. I wash my hands of it. How does that work? Not so well, because usually the person delivers the thing to you on the eve of when you need it. And suddenly you realize it's not what you wanted. And there goes your weekend. Instead of treating delegation as an on-off switch, I encourage people to treat it like a dial. And the delegation dial has 5 notches on it. The notches map to the level of competence, knowledge, experience, and skill the person has to whom you're delegating. Especially if you've been licking all the cookies yourself up to this point. Others don't have the skill developed as much to take on the work. So it's not a one and done, it's not a binary on off switch. You determine where they are in terms of their knowledge, skill, and abilities. And sometimes you simply teach. You show them exactly how it's done and you tell them why. Sometimes you coach, you ask them questions to get them clearer. And after you've covered four notches of the dial, only then do you go to the on off, which is act as a safety net and say, hey, I trust you. Looks like you got this. I'm here if you need me. In all of these cases, delegation does not equal abdication. Create some frequent checkpoints, even for the safety net, so you're not finding out on the eve of a big deliverable.
Yeah, th this reminds me of one of the lessons I teach in leadership, and I don't I love the metaphor here of treating delegation. Don't treat it like an on-off switch. Treat it like a dial, because it's easy for people to think like, okay, the best leaders delegate, therefore I'm going to delegate. It's like, no, the best leaders know when to delegate. The best leaders know how to delegate, and often there are things that leaders shouldn't delegate or uh, subordinates aren't ready to do on their own. And so it's all about figuring out where they're at and when we should delegate, when we should just tell them and guiding them along that process. And I love that, just because we're delegating doesn't mean we're abdicating our responsibility. As we wrap up here, Sabina, any final lesson you'd like to share?
As you go up in ranks, you have a two-way volume control that gets activated. You amplify down and they mute up. In other words, the actions you take, well, to quote Newton, every action has a reaction.
Mhm.
The actions you take have a reaction below. The actions you take will seem louder, more personal, and more dire to them than they are meant to be. And you will not find out the impact because the volume gets muted on the way up. In fact, the more you know, the more senior you are, the less you will know about the reaction to your actions. So, my final words would be if every action has a reaction, do you know what is the reaction your actions are eliciting and how will you find that out?
I've never heard that phrase either, that the volume gets muted on the way up. It reminds me of a story from Adam Galinsky, a professor at Columbia, and he's talking about how he would occasionally set up meetings and just send an email, one-line email like, "Hey, I need to talk with you. Can you meet at 3?"
Oh,
Yeah, the worst thing to do, right? Because then it ruins their day, and they're just wondering the whole time,
completely.
like, what, what did I do wrong? What's going to happen?
Yes,
And it's just
yes,
like he's got this simple thing he was going to ask at 3, but he called it the leader amplification effect, where he didn't appreciate the impact that that's having on others. And then I love this
exactly.
idea of it gets muted on the way up. So how do you? I said that was the last question, but how do you make sure that the volume doesn't get muted on the way up? Like, what do you do to make sure you're hearing correctly the impact that you're having?
I don't think, Nate, it's possible to completely unmute that volume. So the question would be, how do you amplify it even a little bit more?
Okay.
And one is how you react to things that people tell you. So are you lashing out? Are you being defensive? Are you being punitive? Of course, I mean, that's common sense, but hard to do. Another would be to ask really specific questions. So instead of saying, how did that presentation go? Because they're all going to say, yes, boss, that went well. You might say, on a scale of 1 to 10, where was that? And what would it take to get to, let's say they say it was a 7. What would it take? If they say it's a 7, it's probably a 4 or a 5,
Yeah.
first of all. Second, don't ask what would it take to get to a 10, but say what would it take to get to a 7.5 or an 8. So you ask very, very specific questions that are harder for them to wiggle out of, and you'll get some feedback. Also, if you keep asking consistently, then people know you're serious about it. I was just running an offsite for a CEO and his C team. He told me that he wanted me to share any and all feedback I had on how he was showing up publicly with the team. Because he had been telling the team, I want you to give me direct feedback. And of course, he was getting back crickets, or the only feedback he was getting was, boss, you're so wonderful. So I gave him some positives and I also gave him about 5 corrective pieces of feedback. He just stood there and listened. And then at the end of it said, thank you. Here's what happened with the team. They went, wow, you really meant that you really wanted feedback and you were eager to learn. Now they're starting to give him feedback, more of the feedback that he needs.
Yeah, it's great to remember. It's going to be muted, and we're just trying to amplify it so it can be a little bit louder through reacting. We want to reward them psychologically, emotionally for giving us the feedback, specific questions, and then consistency. Well, Sabina, I love these lessons. I look forward to sharing them. I look forward to reading your book where you share, so much hard-earned wisdom that you've gained throughout such a wonderful career. So just want to thank you for coming on the podcast today and sharing such great lessons.
Thank you so much, Nate.